So we're just going to head now into another featured speaker, and this man is a social capitalist and community enthusiast, and over the last 2 decades he's worked with over 1,500 communities throughout Australia and overseas, looking to facilitate fresh and creative ways that stimulate community and economic renewal. Now, his background is as a youth worker, a teacher, a youth education officer, a tertiary lecturer and a public servant. And he's convinced that one cannot develop communities from top down or from the outside in. It requires communities to build from the inside out and for their members to invest themselves, ideas, assets and resources in the process. Now, his consulting work has resulted in assignments in 53 countries and all over Australia. In fact, the rumour goes that it was actually Meghan Markle's veil, those 53 flowers, for our next guest's work in all those countries. But please welcome Peter Kenyon, who is the creator and founder of the Bank of I.D.E.A.S.
Thanks very much, Ellie, for that very positive introduction. I can hardly wait to hear myself speak after all of that. Can I just say it really is a joy to be here this morning, and particularly if we can bring up the slides, for 3 very good reasons that I love being here. The first is this is Adelaide, and I consider it probably the best kind of like heritage city that we have in Australia. I've had the privilege of coming in and out of this place over the last 40 years, and I consider it one of those places that's really helped me to understand particularly this thing called community development. I have amazing memories, and this certainly to me is the ultimate tourist experience. And I need to say my ultimate political hero was Don Dunstan. And I think he was a guy who really did very early introduce concepts of inclusion and multiculturalism. We owe so much to this guy, and to me he was the ultimate kind of like political hero, and it's always good to come here to Adelaide and remember his incredible contribution. Can I also say I love any opportunity to be part of a learning experience, and I think we really do need to salute John and his team for putting on an amazing kind of like workshop, and already we've had the privilege of 2 people who've just blown our minds. To me, learning and leadership, that incredible quote by John F. Kennedy the day he was assassinated, those legacy of words, that speech he was meant to give that night in Dallas, leadership and learning need to kind of like are indispensable from each other. And it just seems to me when one looks at social entrepreneurs, whether they be in the sporting field or any field of community development, they all have one thing in common. They have an insatiable appetite for kind of like learning. They have this will to constantly look at what they're doing and say, can we do it smarter? Can we do it better? Can we do it more effective? And it's events like this that really help us to understand that. Help us to understand that we cannot afford to just kind of like keep peddling the same ways of doing things. We've got to stand back and ask those questions. How do we do it smarter? How do we do it better? How do we actually do it more effective? And it's events like this that enable us to kind of like come and kind of like hear great ideas and to leapfrog on those ideas. If I've got a favourite quote, it would need to be this one. Whoever invented the first wheel was smart, whoever invented the other 3 was the genius. And it just seems to me that it's through not just presentations, but those amazing conversations over lunch and morning tea that we really do gain real great insight into where we can actually go. And so to John and the team, thanks for organising such an amazing kind of like event. And finally, can I say why I am excited to be here is that I am passionate about this thing called community. I think after family, nothing matters more than this. I am a community enthusiast, I'm a social capitalist. I believe passionately that this thing about our connection with each other in those multitude of kind of like communities we belong to. And all of us belong to multiple communities, and I suppose what I want to talk about is how do we relate to them more effectively. We all belong to geographic communities, we may belong to a faith community, many of us belong to kind of like sporting communities. I belong to a kayaking club, which is really an excuse as a drinking community, but you know, really and truly, we all belong to a variety of both geographic and special interest communities. But the one thing that we have discovered is this thing called community ain't what it used to be. I don't know how many of you had the privilege of reading this book by Andrew Lee. Interesting guy. I don't know if you recognise the name. But Andrew Leigh is actually now a politician. In fact, he is the opposition spokesman on finance issues. In fact, if Labor become the new federal government, he will be the finance minister. But the thing most exciting about Andrew is a social capitalist. He did his PhD under the famous Robert Putnam. He is passionate about people's connection in community. It's going to be fascinating to find a finance minister that actually believes in community. It's going to be really interesting to see that performance. But he's put together this amazing piece of research where he looked at what's happened to Australian communities since 1950 through to 2010. And what you can see on the right-hand side is my crude summary of his book. And what he's fundamentally telling us, we just aren't connecting like we used to in terms of community. We just don't seem to have that bonds that we kind of like used to have back there in the 50s and particularly in the early 60s. And what we're finding is that particularly people are not connecting. The fact that only 35% of people now, according to Edith Cowan University, actually trust their neighbours, meaning 65% don't. And the critical reason for that is that only 1 in 3 people can tell you the name of their neighbours on either side of them now in Australia, meaning that we have just kind of like disconnected in many ways. The fact that only 5% of families and parents actually get involved in their kids' parents and citizens group, which really tells us that 19 families bludge on one family to do all that fundraising and all that kind of like community support that needs our schools to keep functioning. We certainly just aren't connecting and getting engaged like we used to. We know participation in sporting activities, we know participation in service groups are really on rapid kind of like decline. And accompanying it is this growth in what I consider now to be the critical issue we face in this country, and it's called loneliness. I don't know if you're aware, but our focus might have been over the weekend on the United Kingdom and a certain wedding. But I don't know if you're aware that only a month ago the United Kingdom also created a new minister called the Minister for Loneliness in the British government. A government at last recognising loneliness as this critical issue. We have a minister here called Ken Wyatt, our only Indigenous member of our federal government. And he has stated at the press club not long ago that 40% of people in a nursing home never get a visitor. Well, I know Ken well, he's our local member where I come from in WA, and he said, Peter, that's an underestimate. I think it's closer to 60%. Now that is horrific. And so this issue called loneliness is the accompanying factor. And I suppose to me, it is one of those things that really undergirds what I want to talk about today. Now I want to declare I am a passionate Freo DOCA supporter. Do I have any other wise people in the audience who might? Actually, I didn't think so, but this is the home of Matthew Pavlich, the person that you didn't kind of like recruit, who went on to become the only player in WA to play 300 games. But you know what, I'm a passionate DOCA supporter, and I put up with what we've been going through now for, 18 years of loss. I was there and I go with my daughter Ellie, and last Saturday we were at this amazing other cricket ground, the Sydney Cricket Ground, Saturday night, to just see ourselves get thrashed yet again by kind of like Sydney. And as we sat there, I can only do 2 things to really try to stop my daughter again from slitting her wrists. The first was to say, Ellie, we didn't lose again tonight, we just kind of like ran out of time, but that didn't kind of like help. But then secondly, I said, you know what, sitting here tonight, Ellie, watching the Dockers against Sydney reminds us of how we do this thing called community. And the analogy is simply this, that most of our communities today are simply like that Australian rules football game, where 30,000 people who need the exercise turn up to watch 36 players who don't. And that is an incredible contributing reason to why we are breaking down kind of like community. And accompanying it is also this kind of like great withdrawal of people from active participants. Today we are a society of spectators, not players. Today we actually do things to and for community rather than much with, and certainly we are not creating much space of and by the community. And it seems to me we are now beginning to see kind of like the results of that. And so why is it that we have kind of like seen this decline in people's connection through our communities? Well, lots of changes, and that one within family, we know so often, it's often been through kids that people kind of like get connected, particularly through sport, and less kids kind of like does mean that some of those things are not happening. The fact that that each of us on average move kind of like residences every 7 years. And then that excuse that so many people use about time pressure, and just don't have time, we're time poor. Yet we still do have time to watch 21 hours of television a week, 3 hours a night. I don't watch any. I was in a motel room last night though, and I turned it on and I thought, boy, if that's the competition, we must be doing really bad in terms of attracting people to get involved. But these are what people put up. Robert Putnam, the famous godfather of social capital, said you can see a correlation between people's involvement in community and the introduction of television in the early 60s. And we know today that people now spend so much more time on the internet than they do physically outside, particularly our kids and whatever. And we know that we have professionalised things. And I suppose that's one of the challenges that we need to talk about today. And with it, we have seen very much the death of kind of like the dependence upon the volunteer, and really the demeaning of people who kind of like come in as volunteers. And there has also been really that kind of like fascination with individualism that we have seen both politically and within kind of like our economy. And that famous kind of like quote by Maggie Thatcher really kind of like summarises very much what has underpinned a lot of what we have seen over the last 30 to 40 years. And then there's all that disillusionment with so much of our traditional kind of like ways of doing things. I love to just go to annual general meetings because I'm a masochist and just sit there and see how boring they are and how everyone is staring at the floor and is terrified of kind of like being found out that they might have to put up their hand to go onto the committee. Really and truly, we have made so much of our organisation so utterly boring. And it's interesting, a recent study we've done with the firefighters and the volunteers in New South Wales about why they have given up being volunteers. And this is firefighters, and at the top of the list is, it is boring. It is no longer fun being engaged. And if volunteer firefighters feel that way, imagine many of our other organisations. And then all that over-regulation and that duty of care type issues and the liability. And we seem to have done nothing to kind of like stop this kind of like paranoia about kind of like how we just control and stop people kind of like getting involved and so on. And all of these factors have kind of like contributed kind of like so much. One only has to look at why would anyone want to volunteer now at a local school when you see kind of like the issues that are actually involved there. And we've allowed this world to kind of like be created. And finally, can I say one of the critical reasons why we have seen this massive decline in people's kind of like commitment and engagement is that we have created a system where we now view people in community not as citizens, not as kind of like co-owners of what's going on in their own community, but we actually now call them, in local government, we call them now customers. We've actually set up customer service centres. What a dumb thing. If I'm a customer, I have a whole pile of expectations. I'm a ratepayer, you should be doing this for me. And it's interesting that 92% of all communications now with local government are complaints. We have created that. And in the health system, we now call people consumers. And in NGOs, we love to call people clients. You know where that word comes from? It comes from a Latin word meaning I'm lying on my back and I am powerless. That is where the word client comes from. I need someone to help me up. What we really need are people to be participants, not recipients. And we have evolved a model of community development over the last 30 years, perhaps the last 50 years, that have reinforced it. So much of what we call community development is doing things to and for community. It's always top down, it's outside in. We always start with what's wrong, what's deficient, we need to kind of like help people type stuff. The result of that kind of like needs model and doing needs assessment before we can do anything means that we view people today in community as I said, as clients, as customers, kind of like as patients, as kind of like consumers and whatever. What we have seen is a model of community development that's evolved where communities are now serviced, not strengthened in terms of the process. It's obviously, when you use that model, it leads to a whole silo approach. So we divide people into their recreation bit, their employment bit, into their kind of like culture bit. We organise our local government the same way. We create silos and we create wedges in community, rather than creating a neighbourhood kind of like support set of systems and whatever. And for that whole system to operate requires heaps of people like you and I, trained professionals who come in and do things to 2 and 4 people. And we wonder why we have a declining engagement in terms of people understanding and appreciating and getting engaged in what we are seeking to do. And so the analogy is that I always ask people, where are we committing our resources? How much is it that we do to community? How much is it we do for community? How much do we do with community? Often that comes down to what we call consultation. We've got a couple of ideas for you and we're wanting your feedback. Is it to be blue or is it to be red? That's the with bit. But it seems to me the quadrant that we so ignore is the one at the bottom on the right. How much do we do is of and by the community? If we want to build community, then really that's where we need to put an increasing amount of our energy. And so what I want to just share with you in my last 15 minutes is 6 clues that I believe we need to think about in terms of how do we create engaged and kind of like inclusive kind of like communities. What are some of the clues that we can perhaps begin to question and use as benchmarks in terms of what we do with this group that we call community? And the first is, I think we've got to start believing a lot more in the power of community and believe that, you know, within community, they're capable of doing anything. I love that quote of Margaret Wheatley. I work from the firm belief that whatever the issue, community, not the latest funding program, not the latest kind of like government department, but community is the answer. And it just seems to me that much of what we're doing is given up on community. I am one of those people that believe that we just need to get back to a lot more citizen-driven type initiative. Rather than being there in this helping mode, how do we enable communities to become co-owners and co-producers of what's actually going on in their communities? I don't know how many of you have ever had the privilege of meeting this guy, Ernesto Ciroli. Anyone met Ernesto? Anyone seen his amazing TED Talk? Well, I need to say I've known this guy a long time. The very first time I ever met him, I thought, boy, he would have to be the most arrogant Italian I have ever met. This guy went to the best kind of like Rome school. This guy came from a wealthy Italian family. This guy went to the best Italian university. This guy did a master's in development studies. He was immediately snapped up by the Italian Foreign Aid Service and sent out to help those poor buggers out there in Africa to get together their agriculture. He arrives in Zambia and he's standing on the banks of the Zambezi River. He cannot believe how stupid local people can be. There is the greatest water source in all of Africa, and those buggers are doing nothing with the water. There is nothing being grown at all on the banks of the Zambezi. He goes into the marketplace and he sees there's an incredible kind of like demand for fresh vegetables, particularly watermelons and tomatoes. He comes back, he tests the soil. It's incredibly fertile. He gathers all the locals together and says, thank God I've been sent here to organise you. You know what? You need to get engaged in growing vegetables on the banks of the Zambezi. And in particular, I've tested the soil and it's just ideal for watermelons and tomatoes. And the locals all just shake their heads in disbelief and say, we don't think it'll work. Of course it will work. I'm an expert. I've been sent to kind of like help you. I've been and I've checked the market. I've tested the soil. We can see with our own eyes how much water you got. And so what happens in Africa? They always end up doing what the wise man from the West tells them to do. And they start planting watermelons and tomatoes. And to the absolute excitement and joy of Ernesto, the biggest watermelons you've ever seen start to appear on the stem. the ripest and most gorgeous looking tomatoes suddenly start appearing, as do 200 hippos out of the Zambezi who eat the entire kind of like crop. And Ernesto is shattered and he gathers the villagers and said, "Why didn't you tell me about the hippos?" And they simply responded, "Well, you never bothered to have a conversation. Why do you think we don't grow anything on the banks of the Zambezi? The hippo is the strongest animal in the world and no fences will keep him out." And we learnt a long time ago, you do not tempt them with watermelons and tomatoes. And Ernesto wrote an amazing book, which I really encourage if you're into facilitation at the community level, called Ripples from the Zambezi. And within it, there's some amazing advice. And one of the best quotes of all is this: "The future of every community lies in capturing the passion, the imagination, and resources of its people." And it seems to me at the heart of what we do, whether we're working in the health, working in recreation, working in any of the sectors to support community, this is the starting point. Let's believe that we need to kind of like tap into that. I also love one of those great quotes that Ernesto loves to share, and that is, "The wisdom of the community always exceeds the knowledge of the experts." And it seems to me the starting point for re-engaging, reigniting this thing called community is kind of like a belief in it in terms of where it's at. And a belief that at the end of the day, strong communities do not come down to how many services we will pump in and how many professionals who will be there to help, but it comes down to the engagement and the use of people who actually live and are part of those communities. The second clue is that why don't we begin to start a lot more where people are at, their neighbourhoods, in their streets, using their language, their culture, starting with kind of like their networks. We are so good at parachuting in our programs and services into community, and we wonder why often they just do not take root. I love one of our great social commentators, Hugh Mackay, and I love his quote: "If I was asked what to do about the level of insecurity and anxiety in contemporary society, I wouldn't start with politics and I wouldn't say too much about terrorism. I'd suggest as a first step you invite the neighbours over for a drink this weekend. Today a drink, tomorrow a barbecue, pretty soon a community." And it seems to me that often the starting point is not, we have this new Butte program you should be doing, but maybe it's about just facilitating people's social connection around things like street parties and whatever. How do we start just getting people together and start discovering each other in our streets and whatever? Only 1 in 3 can tell you the name of their neighbours on either side. Maybe the starting point is beginning to get people kind of like connected. And certainly those of you in Adelaide know just how social media can play a role. This amazing kind of like story of Ray Johnson when his Meals on Wheels kind of like was delivering to the 75-year-old, and he started lamenting about his loneliness and how she then said, "Well, what's your passion?" kind of like Ray, and he said, "Fishing, but all my fishing buddies have died." And she said, "Why don't you put an ad on Gumtree?" You know, he had over 50,000 hits, and today 10 people on a 14-day rotation kind of like take him fishing. You know, sometimes it's about getting back to the basics about how do we start just getting people connected with each other. Because at the end of the day, community building is all about relationship building. And it really is all about relationships. And yet we know that does take time because they move kind of like at the speed of trust. The third thing that we've got to start doing is beginning to discover what people care about and what their contributions are. You know, people are motivated to get involved really by 4 things. We're very good at using the top one, particularly, I can tell you, if you ever want to fill a hall, talk about crime and safety issues, people will come out for things like that out of concern. But it's the bottom 3 that are much more powerful, the ones that grow people's engagement. And it's about really discovering what people care about and who else cares about that. And what is it that I'm interested in that kind of like people can get involved. And really at the heart of inclusion is this belief that there is no strangers in a community. Everyone has a contribution. Everyone has multiple gifts at the head Everyone knows something about something. There's knowledge gifts. Everyone kind of like knows and has gifts of the hands, practical gifts, and everyone has gifts of the heart. Everyone cares about something. I have yet to find a person who is totally apathetic about the whole everything. All of us care about something. And it just seems to me that what we've got to do is to begin to discover that stuff in a systematic way and invite people's participation around it. Last year, the Canadians did this amazing survey where they interviewed hundreds of thousands of volunteers and simply gave them 10 options. Which is the option that really defines why you got engaged, why you put up your hand and got involved as a volunteer? And it's interesting that 82% of their sample chose one of those 10 options that simply said, I volunteer because someone who I know asked me to do something I like doing. Pretty simple way to grow volunteerism. Pretty simple way to grow people's engagement. But there is a catch. You've got to know what turns people on. You've got to know what people care about. And yet that seems to be not really at the heart of the kind of like the questions we ask. Now I want to acknowledge we've got two people here from WA, Paul and Denver. And I was having a coffee with Denver. They work with the sister organisation to John's there. And Denver shared with me this amazing experience, and I always hate telling other people's stories because I may get it wrong. But he was giving a workshop involving 65 cricket clubs at the WACA. Now, we don't talk a lot about cricket these days anywhere in the country, but you know what? Here's a guy who brought together 65 clubs. And their critical issue is, how do we get more people involved? The same old faces seem to end up doing everything. And Denver just posed that simple kind of like question to the 65 representatives and groups there. Well, how many of you do something as simple as this? That you ask your members, firstly, what's your job? Secondly, what are your two main passions of interest? And thirdly, what is that one gift you could contribute to the club? What I find stunning is out of 65 clubs, only one could honestly say they do anything like that. And yet they're all there complaining that people are not getting engaged. In fact, Denver tells the wonderful story of two people who came up and said, what's all this got to do with organising cricket? In fact, one of those guys who made that comment was talking about the fact that he currently has 13 jobs and no one else is interested, and yet still could say, what is all this to do with organising a cricket club? It's at the heart of kind of like getting people's engagement, discovering what it is that people have as contributions. We in my community use something as simple as this, both as a hard and as an internet, where we basically do ask people, what are your gifts of the hands? What are those gifts of the head? What are those gifts of the heart? And it's amazing when you systematically go out there and ask people and have those type of conversations, people respond. And about then, you have the chance of just engaging them. And you know what? People's engagement, particularly if we're coming from a strong principle of inclusion, is absolutely vital. I love what Jody Kretzmann said. Every single person has capacities, abilities, gifts and ideas. And living a good life depends on whether those capacities can be used, those abilities expressed, gifts given, and ideas shared. We know that inclusion is not about just acknowledging people. It is about including people as active participants. I don't know if you're aware that the greatest health issue we now face in this country is called mental health. And this is the World Health Organization definition of positive mental health. It's almost written by someone who believes in this whole model. A state of well-being in which an individual realises his or her abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. It is at the heart of inclusion. It is at the heart of the greatest issue that we face in terms of the health issues in this country. I love the words of this woman, and we all recognise her, Michelle Obama. She is out of Chicago. Chicago is the home of a lot of what we call this asset-based kind of like approach to community development. And I think that quote from Michelle really captures well the power of why this stuff is so important and why the fact that people are wanting to get involved. And yet through the systems and ways that we organise, this often is kind of like ignored in the process. The fourth clue, I think, in terms of building more engaged and more inclusive communities is to genuinely and authentically engage with communities members. I think that simple kind of like set of kind of like 6 words captures really what engagement is all about. It is not about deciding what community you want. It's not about saying, well, there's a couple of options, you can have blue or red. Which one do you want? That's called feedback. That's not engagement. What it is about genuinely engaging with people. And tomorrow, those of you unfortunate enough to be in my workshop will be spending time just looking at what are all those tools. Those who aren't in that workshop, just go on to our website. There is an amazing handbook. Gives you over 35 interesting ways to kind of like really genuinely engage, rather than often the tokenism that we kind of like engage with. And at the heart of all of that is the oldest tool we have in the toolbox for building community. It's called conversation. And I think we've got to learn the art again of conversation. Too many of us are so quick to organise a meeting. Meetings are not conversation. It's usually people sitting like you are with someone out the front with butcher's paper, and we call that a community town meeting or a conversation. It ain't a conversation. Seems to me it's about getting people around a circle. And when you engage people in genuine conversation, boy, people love it. I love that last quote by Mary Lou Casey, what most people need is a good listening to. And it just seems to me that often isn't often within our time frames or kind of like our resource capability, but it has to be. We've got to get down. And one thing I've learned is rarely do I find a decent conversation happens if there's more than 5 people in the group. So if we are organising meetings, break them up into groups of 5 or 4. 6 is one too many. 7 is definitely too many. Just seems to me there's an art in terms of it. The 5th clue is that we have got to become a lot more place-based rather than silo-focused. And again, that quote by Cormac Russell captures so well. We've got to stop driving wedges into community and start to kind of like the way we organise and how we hold hands with people has to kind of like change in terms of where it's at. We've got to move away from siloism, and we've got to begin to discover this thing called collaboration and collective action. I love the words of Bill Mollison, the founder of kind of like permaculture, out of that little town in Tassie of Stanley. I love what he said, I can't save the world on my own. It'll take at least 3 of us. And what he's simply saying is we've got to again learn the art of kind of like holding hands with other people. We've got to take time out to find out who else can kind of like co-partner with us in terms of how we work with community. I love that African quote, if you want to go faster, go alone. But if you want to go further, kind of like go together. And it seems to me we've got to make this thing called collective impact and this thing called collaboration much more a serious principle in terms of how we actually organise. And finally, can I just say that so much of what we do is utterly boring. It seems to me that we've got to reintroduce this fun component. I think Alex put it really well when he said, if you're not having fun, you're not doing it, you're doing it wrong. And it seems to me that this thing called fun is an important ingredient. I love the words of Jim Dyers. Why call a meeting when you can have a party? And it just seems to me that we need to begin to learn once again what all of this is about. Now, I live in an interesting village part of my life, a little place just out of Mandurah. And what I've discovered there is this thing called humour is kind of like part of that fun. And I love those words of kind of like John Cleese. I think he is actually onto something. And in my village down there out of Mandurah, there's a guy who runs a little shop. And boy, people kind of like queue up every day to just see what he actually has on his blackboard. He has a sense of humour that people kind of like turn up for. I love that one. Today's offer, buy any 2 drinks and pay for both, and so on. I love this one the other week, no senior citizen discounts. You've had twice as long to get the money, you know. I just love kind of like that sense of humour. And I love the fact you wander into his shop and everything is kind of like labelled, but you know, it brings a smile. Boy, he runs a very profitable business. And it just seems as I go in there, I think, you know what, this is what we've got to do a bit more in community. We've got to get people having a giggle. We've got to get people having some fun. We've got to be a lot less serious because you know what? We certainly have wrapped enough kind of like rule and regulation around people. How do we start to discover that? And so as I close, can I remind you of the oldest definition we have of community building? It comes from the 6th century China, from a very wise Chinese guy who put it this way. It's almost 1,500 years old, and I wonder whether we've improved on it. Go to the people, live among them, learn from them, love them, start with what they know, build on what they have, but are the best leaders when the task is done, the people will remark, we have done it ourselves. I think those words need to kind of like being think through. I have a friend though here in Adelaide who has that on a desk every day, a reminder of what true community building and development is about. And on the other side, she's rewritten what she thinks is modern interpretation of that. Go to the people with an agenda. Find out what's wrong with them. Tell them what to do. Enable and fix them. Start with what they don't know. Tell them what you think they should know. But are the worst leaders, when the program is done, the people remark, what have they done to us? And I think we have a choice. It's either that or that. And it seems to me that never builds community. We just need to start to learn again what it's about. I think as we gather in our organisations and groups and organisations, I think at every staff meeting we almost need to pose, when we're seeking to engage community, to ask 6 fundamental questions. The first is, what can community members do by themselves, for themselves, without us? Why do we feel we have to be at the heart of everything that goes on? Secondly, what can community members do with a little help from us? And there's a whole pile of things that we can support them with. Thirdly, what do community members need done that they can't do for themselves? And it seems to me that's the order of questions that we need to kind of like start with. And then there's 3 others I'd like to add. What can we stop doing to create more space for more community member action? Fifthly, what can we offer to community beyond services and programs to support resident action? And finally, how can we make our services more asset-focused and community member-driven? And it seems to me they are the 6 questions that really we need to constantly be asking ourselves. And finally, can I leave you with the words of a woman who is one of my heroes out of Canada, Inclusion Canada. And her name is Susan Rands, and I think Susan put it so well in a very challenging way. Our purpose is not to help people. Our purpose is to build a different kind of community for all of us. That is what inclusion and engagement is all about. Thanks very much.